Okay, so this morning I am going to go old school. When I say old school, I mean really old school. We're going to go into Genesis.
So that would be old school.
Genesis chapter 22, starting in verse 1. I'm going to read a story about the first time. I'm going to read a story about the very first time worship was ever mentioned in the Bible. Okay. All right. So yeah, starting out in chapter 22, verse 1 of the book of Genesis. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham. And that word tempt there actually is the same as test. So God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And then he said, Take thy son, thy only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon the mountain which I will tell thee of. Now that one kind of confused me sometimes because he says, your son, your only son, Isaac. I'm thinking, well, what about Ishmael? Wasn't he his son as well? And then if we back up a little bit, we can see why
His son, but not Sarah's
it
son.
means that. Yeah. So it says, if we go back to chapter 21 and verse 9, it says, And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, which she had born unto Abraham, mocking. Wherefore she said unto Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. So at Sarah's request, Abraham disinherited Ishmael. So at that point, legally, Isaac became his only son. And that's why it refers to him as his only son. And there's really significance to that if we tie this into the New Testament. Because God, Jesus was God's only son. So we got to remember there's a correlation there, being the only son. So something had to happen to make Isaac his only son, to make this a repeatable history story. All right, and then picking back up in verse 3 of chapter 22. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And if we study out a little further, the book of Jasher tells us who one of those 2 servants was actually Ishmael that went with him on this trip. But at that point, he was just a servant, no longer an heir. And then the other servant with him is the servant that would have become heir if anything happened to Isaac. And clave the wood for the burnt offering, and rose up and went unto the place of God, which God had told him. And on the 3rd day, another thing that points to correlation to the New Testament. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes up and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said unto his young men, Abide here with the donkeys, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship. Right there, worship. That's the first time worship is mentioned in the Bible. Worship and come again to you. So the worship here is another meaning for the word obedience. So the first time worship is mentioned in the Bible, it's done as an act of obedience. So that act of obedience is worship. And then, if we go back to the book of Jasher again, it explains a lot more. And it talks about how Abraham and Isaac looked up on the mountain, because God didn't tell them exactly where it was until they got to the area. And they looked up on the mountain, and both of them could see a pillar of fire and smoke, but the other 2 servants could not see it. So that's how Abraham knew that it was just him and Isaac that were to go up there. And that's why he said to the other 2 to abide here while they go up and worship, and then come to you again. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife. And they went both of them together. And Isaac spoke unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for the burnt offering. So they both went them together. And they came to a place which God had told him of, and Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called unto him out of heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing that thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes, and looked, and behold, and behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. There's an importance about that. A ram, what that is that's a lamb. It's a male lamb. In a thicket, that's the thorns, caught by his horns. So if we take that into Jesus' time, that's the crown of thorns. That's a symbolistic thing. And what's even more cool about that is the location that this took place. He said it was Mount Moriah. And then later, if we read like in 2 Samuel, it talks about how David bought the threshing floor on the Mount Moriah. So David bought that same place, that same spot, to do a sacrifice for to atone for a sin that he committed that God was punishing the people for. So that was a place of atonement. And then later, that's where Solomon built the temple. And standing on that sacrifice point, off in the distance, was the ram with the thicket, the thorns in its head. And in Jesus' time, from the temple, off in that distance, was where Jesus was crucified and had the crown of thorns put upon his head. So it's how God uses the same places and repeats history. He foretells things with history.
That's awesome.
And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And in Jeshua it talks about how the reason the ram got stuck in that thicket is because the devil put it there to try to stop that ram from getting there, so that he wanted Abraham to go through with the act. Well, because Isaac was the one that his line is going to bring the Messiah. So the devil was trying to kill off that bloodline from the very beginning. And Abraham called the name of that place Jehovah Jireh, which means God our provider, because God provided that lamb. And then God once again provided a lamb for us in that same place with Jesus, his only son. And it is said to this day that the mountain...
Does yours say that?
Since the place the Lord will provide.
Yeah, place of the Lord. Different versions
Ancestor of Jireh.
say different things,
That's
yeah.
awesome.
But, yep. And it is said to this day that in the mount the Lord it shall be seen. And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven a second time, and said, By myself I have sworn, saith the Lord, for because thou hast done this thing, and not withheld thy son, thy only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of heaven, and as the sand which is upon the seashore, and thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemy. And in thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. So the blessings come from obedience. So worship is obedience. And praise is giving God praise. So praise and worship brings blessings. And that's the main point I wanted to get to this week, was the praise and worship brings blessings into our lives. Obedience to God and praising him. And then the sacrifice that Abraham made foretold the sacrifice that God made with Jesus for all of us. Abraham made a sacrifice out of obedience. He was up there in the first place to make that a place of worship. David made a sacrifice up there in the same place to atone for his sins. And then Jesus went the same place and made a sacrifice to atone for our sins. That's just, there's no way that this book is not divine. The way things go together and how God foretells things thousands of years before they happen. Yeah, so Jesus is the sacrifice. Jesus is also the lamb that God supplied in our place, the same as he supplied a lamb in Isaac's place.